What if I told you that before the United States had a navy, before there was a constitution, before America even officially existed, one man controlled its coastline with fire, fear, and pure psychological warfare? Not a legend, not a Disney character, a real pirate. And for a brief moment, in the early 1700s, he was the most powerful force on the Atlantic waters of what would become the United States. His name was Edward Teach, but history remembers him as Blackbeard. In 1718, merchants sailing toward Charleston, Boston, or Virginia didn't fear storms the most. They feared him. And the terrifying part, he didn't need to fire cannons to win. He only needed to be seen. Edward Teach was likely born around 1680 in Bristol, England, one of the busiest port cities in the British Empire. Bristol was a place where boys grew up watching ships leave for the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa. Trade, war, and empire were not distant ideas there. They were everyday life. Young Edward would have seen sailors return with stories of gold, rum, disease, violence, and opportunity. And in that era, the ocean wasn't just adventure. It was power. During the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701–1713, Britain issued letters of marque to privateers, essentially legalized pirates, allowing them to attack enemy ships. Many historians believe Teach began his maritime career this way. Privateering was respectable, profitable, and patriotic. But when the war ended in 1713, thousands of sailors were suddenly unemployed. No more legal looting, no more government pay, just empty pockets and dangerous skills. Many of them refused to go back to ordinary life. They became pirates. By 1716, Teach had joined the crew of Benjamin Hornigold, a well-known pirate operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas. Nassau at that time was practically a pirate republic, loosely controlled, chaotic, and full of men who rejected imperial authority. Teach rose quickly, not because he was the most violent, but because he understood something others didn't. Fear is more efficient than force. In 1717, Teach captured a large French slave ship called La Concorde. Instead of simply stripping it and moving on, he transformed it into his flagship. He renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge. The name was political. Queen Anne had died just a few years earlier, and the British throne had passed to a new royal line. Some believe Blackbeard was signaling loyalty to the previous monarchy. Others think he was mocking the new regime. Either way, it was intentional. Queen Anne's Revenge carried up to 40 guns. That was not a small pirate vessel. That was a warship. And now it belonged to a man who answered to no nation. If you're already realizing this isn't the cartoon version of pirates you grew up with, take a second right now and hit like. This is real American colonial history most textbooks barely touch. And if you're into deep dive stories like this, make sure you subscribe, because what's coming next only gets more intense. By 1717 and early 1718, Blackbeard was operating along the American East Coast, especially near the Carolinas and Virginia. Remember, at this time, there was no United States Navy, no unified American defense system. These were scattered British colonies, vulnerable and economically dependent on maritime trade. That vulnerability became Blackbeard's opportunity. Then came the move that shocked the colonies. In May 1718, Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina. Think about that. One pirate shutting down one of the most important colonial ports in North America. For nearly a week, no ship could enter or leave. He captured multiple vessels and took hostages, including prominent citizens. But here, the surprising twist. He didn't demand gold. He demanded medicine. Reports suggest disease was spreading among his crew. Instead of slaughtering hostages, he negotiated. Charleston's officials scrambled. Supplies were gathered. A deal was made. Blackbeard released the captives and sailed away. That wasn't mercy. That was calculated control. He demonstrated that he could choke a major American port and leave on his own terms. Stories of him spread like wildfire up and down the colonies. Merchants whispered his name, governors panicked, insurance rates rose, trade slowed. And the image of him only made things worse. Blackbeard was tall, imposing, and theatrical. Before battle, he would tie slow-burning fuses into his thick black beard and light them. Smoke would curl around his face, creating a demonic halo effect in the middle of cannon fire. He strapped multiple pistols across his chest. He carried cutlasses at his waist. He didn't just fight. He performed terror. Most ships surrendered without resistance. And here's something crucial. There is very little reliable evidence that Blackbeard routinely slaughtered prisoners. His reputation did most of the work for him. Violence was a tool, not the goal. Dead men don't spread fear. Survivors do. If this story is already changing the way you see early American history, drop a comment and let me know. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're about to step into the final chapter of his life, and it's one of the most brutal naval encounters ever recorded off the American coast. By mid-1718, pressure from Britain was mounting. Piracy was hurting trade. The Crown issued a royal pardon, offering forgiveness to pirates who surrendered. For a moment, Blackbeard appeared to accept it. He even settled briefly in North Carolina. But retirement didn't suit him. Soon he was back at sea. Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, decided enough was enough. Without even consulting North Carolina's governor, he funded a secret mission to eliminate Blackbeard. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy was given 2 small sloops and a clear objective: kill the pirate. In November 1718, Maynard tracked Blackbeard to Ocracoke Island, off the coast of North Carolina. Shallow waters, tight channels, perfect for an ambush. At dawn on November 22, the British ships approached. Cannons fired. Smoke filled the cold morning air. Blackbeard stood on deck, beard smoldering, pistols loaded. The final battle of the most feared pirate in American waters had begun. The chaos that followed would become legend: gunfire at point-blank range, swords clashing on blood-soaked decks, and a death so violent it shocked even hardened sailors. Dawn broke cold over the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet on November 22, 1718. The tide was low. Sandbars lurked just beneath the surface, the kind of waters only experienced coastal sailors could navigate without running aground. Blackbeard knew these waters. That was why he chose them. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, sent by Virginia's governor, knew he was walking into dangerous territory, but he also knew something else. Blackbeard's power came from intimidation, so he needed to survive long enough to get close. As Maynard's 2 small sloops approached, Blackbeard spotted them. There was no dramatic speech recorded, no cinematic dialogue preserved word for word. But we do know this: he did not run. He prepared to fight. Cannons roared first. Blackbeard's ship unleashed a devastating broadside. The blast tore into Maynard's vessels, killing and wounding several men instantly. Wood splintered. Smoke swallowed the decks. Maynard realized something critical in that moment. If he fought at distance, he would lose. So he made a bold decision. He ordered most of his surviving crew below deck. From Blackbeard's perspective, it looked like the British had been nearly wiped out. And that was exactly what Maynard wanted him to think. If you're picturing this like a movie scene right now, that's because history sometimes feels cinematic. But this wasn't fiction. This was happening just off the coast of what would become the United States. If you're enjoying this level of detail, make sure you're subscribed. We're not skipping the brutal parts, we're going all the way through. Seeing what appeared to be a crippled enemy ship, Blackbeard made his move. He brought his vessel alongside Maynard's sloop. Hooks were thrown. The ships locked together. And then Blackbeard and his men boarded. This is where the fight turned personal. As the pirates swarmed the deck, Maynard gave the signal. His hidden men burst up from below. Suddenly, what Blackbeard thought was an easy victory became a close-quarters bloodbath. Gunshots exploded at arm's length. Swords clashed. Men slipped on blood-soaked planks. Smoke and screams filled the air. Blackbeard fought at the center of it all. He was no coward hiding behind his crew. Contemporary reports describe him firing pistols, swinging his cutlass, and pushing forward into the chaos. At one point, he and Maynard reportedly faced each other directly. Maynard fired his pistol. It hit Blackbeard, but it did not drop him. They closed the distance. Steel met steel. Blackbeard was struck again and again. According to later accounts, when his body was examined, he had suffered 5 gunshot wounds and more than 20 cuts from swords and blades. Think about that for a second. 5 bullets, more than 20 blade wounds, and he was still fighting until he collapsed. Eventually, one final slash, reportedly across the neck, brought him down. Blackbeard fell on the deck of his ship. The most feared pirate in American waters was dead. The battle lasted minutes. The legend would last centuries. But what happened next may be even more shocking than the fight itself. Maynard knew killing Blackbeard wasn't enough. They needed proof. So they severed his head. Yes, they cut it off. And then they hung it from the bowsprit of their ship. Not as cruelty, as a message. To every pirate in the Atlantic. To every merchant. To every colony. The Crown had responded. As Maynard sailed back toward Virginia, Blackbeard's head swung visibly at the front of the vessel, a grim trophy signaling the end of an era. If this part of the story just hit you hard, imagine what it meant for sailors at the time. The man who had blockaded Charleston, who had turned American coastal trade into a nightmare reduced to a warning sign. If you haven't already, hit like, because this is the real story of how early America dealt with chaos on its shores. And make sure you're subscribed, because what we're about to unpack next changes how you see pirates entirely. But here, where things get even more interesting. Despite his violent death, Blackbeard did not leave behind mountains of treasure. No confirmed hidden gold hoards. No recovered chests overflowing with silver. That myth, the buried treasure waiting to be discovered, mostly came later. In fact, when authorities searched his ship, they found very little wealth. So if it wasn't treasure, what was he really after? Power, autonomy, control over his own fate in a world dominated by empires. And here's a deeper layer Americans should think about. The early 1700s Atlantic world was rigid. Class structures were strict. Opportunity was limited if you weren't born into it. Pirate ships, in contrast, often operated under surprisingly democratic systems. Crews voted on decisions. Captains could be removed. Loot was divided more equally than in naval service. Piracy wasn't just crime. For some, it was rebellion. That doesn't make it moral, but it makes it more complex. Blackbeard represented a direct challenge to imperial authority on American waters. His defeat wasn't just about stopping robbery. It was about restoring control. After his death in 1718, piracy in the region declined sharply. The British intensified naval patrols. Pardons were enforced. Executions increased. The so-called Golden Age of piracy began to fade. And yet, something strange happened. The man they tried to make an example of became immortal. Stories spread that after his headless body was thrown overboard, it swam around the ship several times before sinking. Almost certainly myth. But myths don't grow around ordinary men. They grow around symbols. If you're still here, you're not just watching a pirate story. You're watching the birth of American coastal order forged through blood, smoke, and steel. And in the next part, we're going even deeper into the myths, the political aftermath, and how Blackbeard transformed from criminal to cultural icon. When Blackbeard's body hit the cold waters off Ocracoke Inlet, the British believed they had ended a problem. They had killed the man, but they had no idea they had just created a legend. His head, mounted at the front of Maynard's ship, was later displayed at the entrance of the Hampton River in Virginia. Sailors passing by would see it, a decaying warning nailed high above the waterline. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge the crown. And for a while, it worked. Piracy along the American East Coast sharply declined. The British increased naval patrols. Colonial governors became more aggressive. Public hangings of pirates became common spectacles meant to terrify would-be outlaws. The golden age of piracy began to fade. But something unexpected happened in the years that followed. Blackbeard didn't disappear from memory. He grew. Stories began circulating almost immediately. Sailors swore that after he was decapitated, his headless body swam around the ship 3 times before sinking into the depths. There is zero reliable evidence that this happened. But that doesn't matter, because myths aren't about facts. They're about impact. And Blackbeard had made an impact strong enough that even his enemies helped amplify it. Writers like Captain Charles Johnson, author of A General History of the Pirates in 1724, turned pirates into larger-than-life figures. That book played a massive role in shaping how the American colonies and Britain remembered piracy. In many ways, Blackbeard became the blueprint for every pirate stereotype Americans know today. The beard, the pistols across the chest, the dramatic personality, the theatrical cruelty. He wasn't the most successful pirate financially. He wasn't the longest lasting, but he was the most memorable. And memory is power. If you're realizing right now that the pirate image in American culture traces back to this one man, take a second to hit like. These are the connections most history classes never slow down to explain. And if you want more deep historical breakdowns like this, make sure you're subscribed, because we're not stopping at surface-level storytelling. Now let's fast forward almost 300 years. In 1996, a private research company discovered the wreck of a ship off the coast of North Carolina near Beaufort Inlet. Artifacts began surfacing: cannons, anchors, medical instruments, even remnants of weapons. After years of study, archaeologists confirmed what many suspected. The wreck was Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's flagship, the ship he had transformed from a captured French vessel into a floating symbol of fear on American waters. Thousands of artifacts have since been recovered: cannons bearing French markings, surgical tools that support historical accounts of pirates desperately needing medicine, gold dust traces, personal items. For the United States, this discovery was more than just treasure hunting. It was physical proof. Proof that the pirate era wasn't fantasy. Proof that America's early coastline was shaped by lawlessness as much as law. And think about this carefully. When we talk about early American identity, we often focus on pilgrims, patriots, and revolutionaries. But before 1776, before independence, the waters that would become American territory were a battleground between empire and rebellion, and pirates like Blackbeard were part of that story. He represented something uncomfortable but real: a rejection of authority, a challenge to economic control, a man who carved out temporary freedom in a rigid imperial world. That doesn't make him a hero, but it makes him historically significant. And here's something even more interesting for an American audience. The colonies that struggled with piracy in the early 1700s later became the same regions that pushed back against British authority in the 1760s and 1770s. Different motivations, different contexts, but the idea of resisting centralized power was already in the Atlantic air. Piracy forced colonial governments to cooperate more closely with Britain on security. It exposed weaknesses in defense. It influenced maritime law. It shaped trade insurance systems. In other words, pirates like Blackbeard indirectly helped push the colonies toward more organized governance. Chaos forced structure. Violence forced policy. That's part of the hidden legacy. If you've made it this far, you're seeing how one pirate's life connects to the bigger arc of American development. Drop a comment and tell me, Did you ever think of Blackbeard as part of early American history like this? And if you're still watching, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to close this story by separating the final myths from reality. Let's address the treasure question. Despite countless legends, there is no confirmed evidence that Blackbeard buried massive treasure hoards along the East Coast. No secret maps have ever been authenticated. No chests of gold recovered from mysterious islands tied directly to him. Most pirate wealth was spent quickly on supplies, repairs, bribes, and crew shares. The romantic idea of buried treasure largely grew from later fiction. What Blackbeard truly left behind wasn't gold. It was narrative. He became a symbol used by writers, filmmakers, theme parks, and pop culture for centuries. From novels to Hollywood films, from Halloween costumes to amusement park attractions, the image of the pirate captain with a smoking beard traces back to a real man who once blockaded Charleston. But here's the final layer. Blackbeard's story isn't ultimately about piracy. It's about power. Who controls trade? Who controls the sea? Who enforces the law? And what happens when someone dares to operate outside that system? For 2 years, he bent Atlantic commerce to his will, and it took a coordinated political and military effort to stop him. That says something, not just about him, but about the fragile nature of early American order. If this deep dive changed how you see pirates and early American history, make sure you hit like. And if you want more long-form historical breakdowns that go beyond the myths, subscribe and stay with this channel. We're building a library of stories that deserve to be told in full. Blackbeard died in 1718, but nearly 3 centuries later, his shadow still stretches across American waters. And maybe that's the most powerful legacy of all.